This was not just a bomber. It was the moment Germany realized the war was already lost. This was not just another bomber. It was proof of a war Germany could never win. And the moment a German engineer stood before it, he understood one terrifying truth: Berlin would never be safe again. It was 1945, and Germany was exhausted in body and in spirit. Cities lay crushed beneath layers of rubble. Factories that once powered the Reich stood silent, and the skies that had once belonged to the Luftwaffe now felt hostile, almost alien. This was no longer a nation planning victory, it was a nation measuring loss. Inside Luftwaffe technical facilities, engineers were no longer dreaming of revolutionary aircraft. They were cataloging damage, studying wreckage, and asking a question that had no comforting answer: how had the enemy moved so far ahead? It was during this final phase of the war that something unusual arrived on their tables, something that did not look like defeat, but like a glimpse into a future Germany had failed to reach. Fragments of an American bomber, recovered through intelligence channels from the Far East, were transported quietly for inspection. The aircraft was designated B-29 Superfortress. At first, it was dismissed as another heavy bomber, larger perhaps, but nothing fundamentally different from the B-17s and B-24s already filling European skies. But that illusion did not survive close examination. As the German engineer ran his hands across the metal skin, he immediately sensed something unfamiliar. The construction was not experimental, it was not rushed. This was not a prototype struggling toward completion. This aircraft was refined, standardized, and built for repetition. The alloy composition was consistent, the riveting was precise, the internal wiring was organized not for a single aircraft, but for thousands. To a German engineer trained in an environment of shortages and improvisation, this alone was unsettling. The realization came quickly and quietly. This machine belonged to an industrial system operating on an entirely different scale. As the inspection moved inward, the shock deepened. The cockpit was sealed, fully pressurized. This meant the crew could operate at altitudes exceeding 30,000 feet without oxygen masks, without the fatigue that plagued German bomber crews. Germany had explored pressurized cabins years earlier. The concepts existed, the drawings existed, but the materials, the engines, and the production capacity had never aligned. Each attempt collapsed under its own complexity. America, it seemed, had crossed that barrier effortlessly. The engineer noted the pressure control systems, the valves, the insulation, all integrated as if high-altitude flight were routine. For Germany, it had been a dream. For America, it was standard procedure. Then came the defensive systems. There were no gunners sitting behind exposed glass bubbles, no men freezing at altitude while tracking enemy fighters by sight alone. Instead, the B-29 used remotely controlled gun turrets. Electric motors, analog computing systems, and centralized fire control allowed a single crewman to aim multiple turrets with precision. This was not just engineering sophistication, it was a philosophical shift. Where German aircraft still relied heavily on human endurance and reflex, the B-29 reduced the human role and amplified the machine. Fewer crew members, less fatigue, greater accuracy, and higher survivability. The engineer understood immediately what this meant in combat. German fighters would be engaging bombers they could barely reach, defended by systems that never tired, never hesitated, and never panicked. And then came the most disturbing realization of all.
Intelligence reports confirmed that the B-29 was not rare. It was not a prestige weapon built in small numbers. It was being produced in the hundreds. Entire factories in the United States were dedicated to its construction. While Germany struggled to complete a single advanced bomber amid air raids and material shortages, America treated the B-29 as an industrial product. Assembly lines moved steadily, components arrived on schedule, skilled labor was abundant, training programs produced crews as fast as aircraft rolled out of hangars. To the German engineer, this was the true weapon, far more dangerous than bombs or guns. It was the system behind the aircraft. Germany had believed that superior engineering could compensate for limited resources. The B-29 proved that belief fatally wrong. Engineering brilliance meant little without the industrial power to sustain it. As the engineer reviewed range calculations, the implications became unavoidable. From bases in Europe, an aircraft with this range could reach Berlin, Hamburg, Munich, and return without fighter escort. Existing German air defenses were simply not designed to stop such a machine. Interceptors lacked the altitude performance, radar coverage was inconsistent, fuel shortages crippled response times. Even if a few bombers were lost, the production rate ensured replacement within days. This was not attrition warfare, this was inevitability. The engineer recorded his findings carefully, knowing full well that the war was nearly over, but his conclusions went beyond the present moment. The B-29 was not built for Germany, it was built for the future. It represented an approach to warfare where victory was decided not at the front line, but in factories, supply chains, and training pipelines thousands of kilometers away. Standing there among twisted metal and exposed wiring, the engineer finally understood what had truly doomed the Reich. It was not a single battle, it was not a single decision, it was the inability to match an enemy who had turned war itself into an industrial process. The B-29 did not just threaten cities, it threatened the very idea that Germany could ever catch up. And in that silent hangar, surrounded by the remains of a machine from another world, the conclusion became unavoidable. The war had been lost long before the bombs fell. It had been lost the moment America learned how to build the future faster than Germany could destroy it.
That realization settled heavily on the engineer's mind because it explained everything Germany could no longer deny. For years, German aviation had chased perfection. Every aircraft was expected to be faster, more elegant, more advanced than the last. But perfection required time, and time was the one resource Germany no longer possessed. The B-29 revealed a different philosophy altogether. It was not obsessed with brilliance alone. It was obsessed with repeatability. Every system inside the aircraft was designed to be built again, repaired quickly, and improved without stopping production. Even the damage patterns told a story. Components were modular, sections could be replaced instead of rebuilt. Maintenance crews required less improvisation and fewer rare materials. To a German engineer accustomed to hand-fitted parts and constant shortages, this approach felt almost alien. It was engineering designed for endurance, not desperation. As reports continued to arrive from the Pacific, the picture became even darker. Japanese fighters struggled to intercept the Superfortress at altitude. Anti-aircraft fire was often ineffective, and when losses did occur, replacements arrived with unsettling speed. The engineer compared this to Germany's own situation. Every advanced aircraft lost over the Reich represented months of lost labor, scarce alloys, and pilots who could not be replaced. The balance was no longer mathematical, it was structural. The war had become asymmetrical, and Germany was on the wrong side of that imbalance. What troubled the engineer most was not what the B-29 was doing to Japan, but what it could do if it were ever deployed fully over Europe.
Germany's air defense doctrine had been built around the assumption that bombers would be slow, vulnerable, and limited by crew endurance. The B-29 shattered all three assumptions. It flew higher, farther, and with fewer human limitations than anything Germany had prepared for. Even revolutionary late-war fighters could not solve the problem of fuel shortages, pilot training, and maintenance collapse. Technology alone could not compensate for a system that was already breaking apart. As the engineer finalized his assessment, he understood that the B-29 was not merely an aircraft, but a signal. It marked the transition to a new era of warfare, where industrial depth determined victory long before the first bomb was dropped. Germany had entered the war believing it could out-engineer the world. The Superfortress proved that the world had outproduced Germany instead. And in that understanding lay the most bitter truth of all. No redesign, no miracle weapon, no last-minute breakthrough could change the fundamental reality exposed by the B-29. The future of war no longer belonged to those who built the most daring machines. It belonged to those who could build them endlessly.
By the time the implications of the B-29 were fully understood, the German war machine was already unraveling from the inside. What the Superfortress exposed was not merely a technological gap, but a systemic failure that no late-war innovation could repair. Germany had entered the conflict believing that superior design would outweigh material limits, but the reality of total war demanded something different. It demanded endurance, redundancy, and scale. The American approach to warfare had quietly embraced this truth years earlier. While Germany refined and re-refined individual aircraft, the United States built systems that assumed loss and planned for replacement. Every B-29 destroyed was already accounted for in production schedules thousands of miles away. For German planners, this concept was deeply unsettling. Their entire strategic culture was built around decisive weapons, not endless output. As the war dragged on, the contrast became impossible to ignore. American factories operated beyond the reach of enemy bombers, protected by oceans and distance. Power grids were stable. Raw materials flowed uninterrupted. Training pipelines expanded rather than collapsed. Germany, by contrast, fought under constant aerial attack. Skilled labor was killed or dispersed. Fuel shortages crippled testing programs. Aircraft rolled out incomplete, rushed into service without proper evaluation. The engineer who had examined the B-29 understood that no single decision had caused this divergence. It was the cumulative result of strategic assumptions made long before the first shots were fired. Germany had planned for a short war, won through speed and shock. America had prepared for a long one, fought through attrition and logistics. The Superfortress was the physical embodiment of that preparation. As reports from the Pacific continued to circulate, the psychological impact deepened. Japanese defenses were collapsing not because of inferior courage or skill, but because they were facing an enemy capable of sustaining pressure indefinitely. Cities burned not because of tactical mistakes, but because the attacks never truly stopped. The engineer recognized the same fate awaiting Germany had the war continued. Even the most advanced interceptors, even radical jet designs, could not alter the underlying imbalance. Fuel shortages alone ensured that any technological breakthrough would remain symbolic rather than decisive. Pilots could not be trained fast enough. Spare parts could not be delivered reliably. Airfields could not be repaired under constant bombardment. The B-29 did not need to defeat German fighters one by one. It only needed to keep flying. And it could. What haunted German engineers most was the realization that the Superfortress represented a shift in the very logic of warfare. Wars were no longer won by moments of brilliance or daring maneuvers alone. They were won by production curves, supply resilience, and the ability to absorb losses without strategic collapse. Germany's economy had been optimized for efficiency, not resilience. When stress increased, the system fractured. America's economy, sprawling and redundant, absorbed pressure and grew stronger under it. The engineer reflected on early war years, when German victories had seemed effortless. Those successes had masked deeper weaknesses. Each campaign consumed resources faster than they could be replaced. Each occupied territory required garrisons, transport, administration. The industrial base stretched thinner with each conquest. Meanwhile, American industry expanded untouched, learning, adapting, and scaling. By the time the B-29 appeared, the outcome was already encoded into the structure of the war itself. The aircraft merely revealed it in metal and rivets. Even the language used to describe weapons had changed. German projects were named individually, almost personally. American weapons were numbered, categorized, standardized. One culture sought masterpieces, the other sought reliability. As the engineer closed his report, he understood that history would not remember the B-29 only for the destruction it caused, but for what it symbolized. It marked the moment when warfare fully entered the industrial age, where victory belonged to those who could transform science into production at scale. Germany had brilliant minds, daring designers, and courageous pilots. But brilliance without sustainability was no longer enough. The future belonged to systems that could endure longer than any single battle or campaign. And in that future, Germany had no place. The war was ending, but the lesson would outlive it. The age of isolated genius was over. The age of industrial dominance had begun.
As the war drew to its inevitable conclusion, the meaning of the B-29 extended far beyond the burning cities it left behind. For German engineers, officers, and planners who survived long enough to reflect, the Superfortress became a symbol of a world that had permanently changed. This was not simply about defeat, it was about displacement. The center of military power had shifted away from traditional European battlefields and toward nations capable of sustaining global industrial warfare. The B-29 was the clearest signal of that shift. It demonstrated that distance no longer guaranteed safety, that oceans no longer provided insulation, and that industrial reach mattered more than geographic position. In its design, Germany saw the future of air power laid bare. High-altitude operations, long-range precision, automated defense systems, and centralized command logic were no longer experimental concepts. They were operational realities. And they were being deployed not in limited numbers, but as part of a relentless production rhythm. When news reached Europe that the B-29 had delivered a weapon unlike any before it, the final confirmation arrived. Warfare had crossed a threshold from which there was no return. The atomic bomb was not merely a new explosive, it was the logical endpoint of the same industrial philosophy that produced the Superfortress. A weapon so complex that only a vast, coordinated system of science, manufacturing, logistics, and training could deliver it. German planners understood immediately what this meant. Even if Germany had survived the war intact, it could not have competed in this new era without fundamentally transforming its entire economic and political structure. The age of national mobilization had given way to the age of total systems integration. In the post-war years, Allied analysts would study German engineering with admiration, but also with a clear conclusion. Innovation without scale was fragile. Precision without redundancy was vulnerable. Speed without sustainability led only to exhaustion. The B-29 rewrote the rules. It taught the world that the decisive battles of the future would be fought long before the first shot was fired, inside factories, research laboratories, and supply networks. For the German engineer who had once examined its wreckage, this understanding lingered long after the war ended. He knew that the Superfortress had not defeated Germany by firepower alone. It had defeated an entire way of thinking, a belief that brilliance could substitute for endurance, a belief that speed could replace preparation, a belief that short wars could be planned and controlled. None of those assumptions survived contact with American industrial warfare. The skies of the post-war world would be shaped by the lessons of the B-29. Strategic bombers, nuclear deterrence, global reach, and automated systems would define military planning for decades to come. Nations that understood this reality would endure. Those that did not would fall behind, just as Germany had. And so the story of the B-29 is not only a story of World War II, it is the story of the moment modern warfare was born, a moment when victory became a matter of systems rather than heroes, of production rather than daring, of endurance rather than speed. Standing at the edge of that realization, Germany saw its reflection in the polished metal of a machine it could never match. The war ended soon after, but the message remained. The future would belong to those who could build it, protect it, and sustain it longer than anyone else. And in that future, the shadow of the B-29 would stretch far beyond the